Okay, so, we've been diving into some pretty heavy stuff lately. You sent over some sources focusing on teens, specifically teens with ADD, and just the challenges they face as they grow up. The whole parent-teen dynamic.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating because if you think about adolescence on its own right, there are so many changes happening. It's like this volatile mix. They're already trying to find their own identity, pull away from their parents. And then when you add in ADD, it can create, a lot more conflict because you've got these characteristics of impulsivity and, kind of what looks like oppositional behavior.
Yeah, that's that counter will the sources talk about. Like you tell a little kid not to touch something, and bam, they want to push that button. But when it comes to teenagers, it's amplified, and it's like they're rejecting everything their parents say.
Exactly. And what happens is, as teenagers get older, parents start to worry, right? It's like, "Oh my gosh, they're going to be adults soon and they're still struggling with these things. We need to fix it." And so you see this urgency from parents to, try to correct those behaviors.
To get them to cooperate, to be more organized, all that good stuff. And the material you shared really highlights how frustrating that can be for parents.
Mm.
Like you get to the point where it's just intolerable.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's where we see that parents can kind of swing between two extremes. Either they become really controlling, trying to clamp down on everything, or they just give up and become super permissive. And finding that middle ground, forget about it. It's like a lost art.
It's just chaos.
Mm.
And I can only imagine the toll that takes on the parents. The sources even say that a lot of them are at their wits' end by the time they, seek professional help, and they think getting a diagnosis is going to be the answer.
It is incredibly stressful. And I think it's important to remember that, the author of this research actually raised children with ADD themselves, so they get it. But what they really try to emphasize is that even though it's tough, there's a lot of potential for healing within the family.
Yeah.
It's not hopeless.
There's hope. That's good. Okay, so the source makes this really interesting point about teenagers and their seemingly, constant rejection of their parents. They say it might not be what it looks like on the surface.
It's true. Because, what they're saying is that even when teenagers seem to be pushing their parents away underneath it all, they still really crave that love and acceptance from them. And if parents can offer that unconditionally without trying to, mold them into something they're not, it can be incredibly powerful.
More powerful than peer pressure. That's a bold statement.
It is. But the source really emphasizes that this is particularly true for teenagers with ADD. They tend to be more sensitive emotionally, so, they might have a tougher exterior. But inside, that need for connection with their parents is still very strong.
So if they feel like they're being respected as an individual, they're more likely to stay connected.
Yes. And this leads us to the whole issue of autonomy and control. Because what happens a lot is parents say things like, "Oh, my teenager just doesn't listen to a word I say." But what the source suggests is that maybe it's not that they aren't hearing the words, it's that the way it's being said is pushing them further away.
It's like every interaction feels like a lecture, so of course they're going to tune out.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the diagnosis itself. The material we've got here suggests that for a lot of teenagers, getting that ADD diagnosis isn't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you'd think it would be a relief, but for teenagers, they're already dealing with so much socially that they really don't want to feel different. And there's this fear that an ADD diagnosis means that there's something wrong with them mentally.
And that their parents will just blame everything on the ADD.
Exactly. It's like their whole experience is being reduced to this label. And the source actually shares a quote from this girl named Lara, who was one of the first teenagers the author worked with. She said she felt like her parents were just trying to pretend that the only thing wrong is in my head. That's powerful, right?
Wow. Yeah, it really shows how invalidating that can feel.
Yeah.
It's like they're not being seen as a whole person. So the source actually goes into detail about Lara's situation. Can you walk us through her story?
Sure. So Lara was 16 years old, and her biological father wasn't in the picture. Her mom had remarried, and she had a younger half-brother. And although she got along okay with her stepdad, she felt like he was always on her case, always criticizing her, setting all these rules, even though he wasn't her real dad.
So she was outnumbered, basically.
Yeah, and it led to a lot of arguments with both her mom and her stepdad. And when the author talked to Laura's mom, it became clear that she was kind of letting her husband take the lead when it came to discipline, which meant lots of rules and punishments, even for little things. And in the middle of all this conflict, Laura's mom was more focused on keeping things calm with her husband than really listening to Laura's side of the story.
No wonder she felt so isolated, like her own mom wasn't on her side.
Right, and she was scared that her mom was choosing her new family over her. But the author pointed out something really interesting. He said that Lara's resistance to all this control actually showed that her mom had been a good parent in the past, because she hadn't just become completely obedient out of fear.
So there was still a good foundation there somewhere. And Lara did meet the criteria for ADD, right?
She did. She had trouble concentrating, was impulsive in class, forgot about her schoolwork, and had really bad study habits. But she didn't see these things as a big problem.
That lack of self-awareness the source talks about.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Lara. The adults around her, her parents and teachers, they didn't fully get how their own actions were making things worse.
So it wasn't just Lara who needed to change.
Right. It was a family dynamic. And the author knew that just focusing on the ADD diagnosis or Lara's bad grades wouldn't help, especially because he knew that telling an insecure teenager who just wants to be normal that her struggles are all about brain chemicals wasn't going to resonate.
Makes sense. So what did he do?
He told both Lara and her mom that ADD was a possibility and that it could be helpful to address it. But he was very clear that the ADD wasn't the cause of their family problems, it was the way they were interacting with each other. And he suggested that maybe they needed to rethink all those strict rules because it seemed like they were making things worse, not better. He said the priority should be on improving communication and understanding within the family. The diagnosis and treatment could come later.
So he focused on the relationship first.
Yes. And then he talked to Lara's mom and stepdad and encouraged them to give Lara more space and to work on their own relationship so that her mom wouldn't feel so stuck in the middle all the time. And surprisingly, Lara's parents were open to this.
And how did that affect Lara?
She was shocked. She said it was the first time she felt like anyone was actually listening to her, and that made a huge difference. Just a few months later, she was more willing to talk about her ADD, and she even decided to try medication, although the first one didn't work out because of side effects.
But she didn't give up, right?
No. 2 years later, she was doing amazingly well in her favorite subject, which had never happened before. And her mom said that even though she still had some trouble focusing, she was a lot more motivated and was even making plans for college. The family also kept going to counseling, and things were much better at home.
That's amazing. And the source makes this really important point that things got better for Lara once she felt like she was in control.
Yes, she felt empowered. And from Lara's case, the author came up with some key principles that can be applied to teenagers with ADD in general. The first one is that they really need to feel heard and understood before they can even start to look at themselves and think about making changes.
It's like if you feel judged all the time, you're not going to be open to anything.
Exactly. And they feel so misunderstood, which makes every criticism feel like a personal attack. That's why the author says that arguing with them or trying to be logical just makes things worse.
Sometimes it feels impossible to get through to them.
I know, and the source also points out that in the parent-teen relationship, the parents have more power. So it's their responsibility to try to change things by really listening to their teenager and understanding how they feel without getting defensive.
So the parents have to make the first move.
They do. And it's so important to remember that listening to someone and validating their feelings doesn't mean you agree with what they're doing. What the author found is that once teenagers with ADD feel accepted, they're much more open to looking at themselves and getting help.
So it all starts with that foundation of respect and understanding.
Okay, so the source also gives this advice that some parents might find a little hard to swallow. They say that sometimes you need to relax the rules and regulations.
I know it sounds counterintuitive, but when you're dealing with teenagers, especially those with ADD who have that strong counterwill, sometimes giving them a little more freedom can actually be more effective. Because what they're really fighting for is autonomy, not just more privileges.
Can you give an example?
Sure, like think about a teenager's bedroom. Parents might hate the mess, but it's their space. As long as it's not bothering anyone else, the source says, just close the door. And with older teens, things like phone calls or bedtime can be up to them as long as it's not disrupting the family.
So it's about respecting their personal boundaries.
Exactly. And the author believes that respecting their boundaries helps them learn to respect the boundaries of others, which is a big part of growing up.
And then there's the whole homework battle, which is a nightmare for a lot of families. Yeah, well, the source is pretty straightforward about that. They say if the relationship with your teenager is already strained, back off the homework issue. They say failing a grade isn't the end of the world, and that a teenager who's struggling with self-esteem needs unconditional love and the chance to make their own choices more than they need good grades.
So the long-term emotional well-being is more important than short-term academic success. But that's a tough one for a lot of parents to accept.
It is, but think about it. Nagging and criticizing a teenager all the time just pushes them away. The source suggests focusing on what the teenager wants to achieve in school and supporting them once there's trust in the relationship, because younger kids might need more direction, but when the relationship is shaky, any kind of direction feels like you're forcing them.
And that just creates more resistance. So it all comes back to the relationship. The source also talks about how important it is to not interfere once you've given your teenager some autonomy, even if you don't agree with their choices.
Right, because the idea is that people learn best from their own mistakes. And the author even tells parents to practice biting their tongues until it hurts because it's so hard to do.
It's that natural instinct to want to protect your kids.
I know. But the source asks, how do we teach self-discipline? And the answer they give is that pressuring teenagers isn't the way to do it. Respecting their autonomy gives them the space to develop self-discipline on their own.
So sometimes less control actually leads to more self-control in the long run. Now, the source also reminds us that teenagers see the world differently than adults do. They have different priorities. They even mention Holden Caulfield and how he thought adult concerns were absurd.
It's a good reminder that teenagers are going through their own thing and they have their own values and concerns. And if we want to connect with them, we need to acknowledge that their perspective is valid even if we don't always agree.
Which brings us to Angus, a 16-year-old with ADD.
Huh.
The source shares a conversation with him, and his insights are really helpful for understanding the teenage point of view.
Yeah, Angus was a smart kid, but he had some issues in the past with drugs and getting expelled from school. The author had known him since he was a baby, and Angus really talked about how complicated it is for teenagers to deal with an ADD diagnosis. He was great at subjects he loved, like history and English, but teachers and other subjects always complained about his attention and note-taking.
And what about medication? How do you feel about that?
He didn't like it. He saw it as a way to control his behavior. He said, it's just the way I am, and why should he have to change just to make it easier for other people? And then he asked this really powerful question. If you can't accept me for me, then what are you looking for? What do you want from me?
Wow, he's asking for unconditional acceptance.
Exactly. And he knew that even though ADD could be a problem, it was often mixed up with other things like family issues, addiction, and low self-esteem, things that medication couldn't fix. What he needed was to be accepted for who he was. And the author emphasizes how important it is to respect that a teenager might not be sure about getting an ADD diagnosis.
It sounds like Angus, even though he had his struggles, really knew himself and what he needed. And it wasn't about being fixed.
Exactly. He understood that his struggles were complex and that a diagnosis wasn't the whole story. So to kind of sum up, what's the main takeaway from all this about understanding teenagers, especially those with ADD?
It seems like the key is to approach them with empathy and respect for who they are, and to really listen to them and try to understand their feelings, and to remember that they're becoming more independent and to respect that.
Yeah, it's not about trying to control them or force them to change. It's about building a strong relationship based on trust and understanding, and to remember that focusing on the relationship and their emotional well-being is more important than trying to fix them quickly or get them to do what you want.
It's about changing your perspective. So here's a question for our listeners. Think about the teenagers in your life. Are you maybe focusing too much on controlling them instead of connecting with them? And what could you do differently to build a more positive and understanding relationship? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.